So welcome to the Hyperpolyglot Activists, Learn Languages, Make a Difference. My name is Dr. Carlos Yebra Lopez, and I'm here today joined by a world-class expert in language revitalization, Professor Ghil'ad Zuckermann. Welcome.
Hello, Carlos. It's wonderful talking to you.
Thank you so much for making it to the show. And Professor Zuckermann is in a very unique position to talk about how to make a difference with language learning, because he's a professor of linguistics and the chair of endangered languages at the University of Adelaide in Australia. And talk to us a little bit about your recent, very successful book, Revivalistics. I think some people might be confused as to the difference between language revitalization and revivalistics. There you go. So why don't we start with this? What is revivalistics?
Revivalistics is a new transdisciplinary field of inquiry surrounding three types of language revival. Language reclamation, which means the revival of a no longer spoken language like Hebrew, like Bangla, an Aboriginal language of South Australia. Revivalistics also has to do with revitalization, which means the revival of a severely endangered language, say like Adnya Matna, another Aboriginal language of South Australia that has several elders who still speak the language, but the percentage of kids who speak the language is almost zero. So when I determine whether a language is endangered or not, I don't care about the number. What I care about is the percentage of kids speaking the language. And revivalistics also has to do with language reinvigoration, which means the revival of a language that has a high percentage relatively of speakers, but it is still endangered. For example, Welsh, for example, Te Reo Maori, the language of New Zealand, for example, even Cantonese, which is alive and kicking, but still Mandarin is kind of glottophagizing it. It's beginning to eat it. And revivalistics is transdisciplinary because it looks at language revival from any angle, not just from linguistics, which is the obvious angle, but also from the angle of, say, mental health. Is there a link between language revival and well-being? Or from the angle of law, is it the case that we should give money to people who lost their language due to linguicide, due to language killing? Also from the point of view of architecture, for example, I can ask an architectural question: should we revive an Aboriginal language that became a sleeping beauty or a dreaming beauty? Should we revive it in a governmental building, which is Western, thus giving the Aboriginal people the feeling that the government is behind them? Or should we revive it in an environment, in an ecology, in an architecture which is much more Aboriginal, for example, under a tree in the bush, in the outback? Or should we do a kind of a Western building, but with an Aboriginal design? I mean, this is a question of architecture that revivalistics has to ask. So revivalistics is a revolution because, you know, I mean, how many languages were revived, say, 100 years ago? Not too many. I mean, my mother tongue, which I call Israeli, which is a revival language resulting from the Hebrew revival, is one of the only languages known as revivals. But language revival will become more and more common in the future.
Yeah, I think your book, as you just described, it offers a fascinating range of topics that we will touch upon here. But before we delve into that, what is the book structured like? I understand that there are two different parts. One where Hebrew and the transition between Hebrew to Israeli is discussed, and then another one where there are more like practical, clear, insight, actionable advice that people can use to revitalize languages. Is that so?
Yes, exactly, Carlos. So the book reflects my own journey from the promised land, that is Israel, to the lucky country, that is Australia. Of course, everything is in quotation marks. I arrived in Australia in 2004, and I asked myself, how can I give back to the host society? I was very grateful at the time to the Australian society as a migrant. You know, I mean, we are all migrants in this world. I mean, after all, we are all from Africa originally. And then I said to myself, okay, Australia has two main problems. The first problem, of course, is bureaucracy. Modern Australia, ab initio, is neither a democracy nor an aristocracy. It's a bureaucracy. Israel is an ad hocracy. Everything is ad hoc, but Australia is a bureaucracy. I could talk about it at length, but what can a professor, what can an academic, what can a linguist help in bureaucracy? I can only swallow the bitter pill. What is the other problem of Australia? I asked myself in 2004, the Aboriginal plight, the fact that Aboriginal people had been here for 50,000 years at least. Of course, they were walking from Africa. We are all from Africa, as I said. But when the Anglos, when the colonizers arrived, the Aboriginal people lost their land, they lost their intellectual sovereignty, they lost everything. And I said, okay, had I been a psychologist, I would have done anti-smoking therapies, because many Aboriginal friends of mine unfortunately smoke. Had I been a dentist, I would have given pro bono, dental treatment, etc. I am a linguist. What can I do? And then I realized that out of 400 Aboriginal languages, only 12 are alive and kicking, which is 3%. Only 12 are spoken by 100% of the Aboriginal tribe. What happened to the other languages, which is 400 minus 12, right? So it's 388 languages. Well, they became sleeping beauties or dreaming beauties because of Jukurpa, dream time. I call them dreaming beauties in Australia, whereas Hebrew is referred to me as a sleeping beauty. I said there is a niche here that I should establish, and the niche was revivalistics. And I decided to apply lessons from the Hebrew revival to the empowerment of Aboriginal languages in Australia and then all over the world. So coming back to your question about the structure of the book Revivalistics, I start with Israeli and I analyze Israeli, which is the result of the revival of Hebrew, as a revival language, not as a Semitic language. You see, usually linguists talk about languages as belonging to a specific family, which is according to the Stammbaum model. I argue that revival languages contradict the Stammbaum model, the family tree model in historical linguistics. Why? Because when you reclaim a sleeping beauty, you end up with a hybrid. The hybrid language is based on the one hand on the language you are trying to reclaim, and on the other hand, it is based on your mother tongue or your mother tongues. So for example, if I, together with the Bangla people of South Australia, would like to reclaim Bangla, which I do, I have no doubt in my mind that the Neo-Bangla would reflect not only the ancient Bangla, which unfortunately was subject to linguicide, to language killing, but Neo-Bangla will also reflect English, Aboriginal English, Israeli, which is my own mother tongue, German, which is the language of the person who wrote down the dictionary in 1844, Clamor Wilhelm Schumann, etc. So the revival language belongs to the family of revival languages, not the family of Tura-Yura languages, or not the family of Semitic languages in the case of Israeli. So I hope I made myself clear about it. So from the description of Israeli as a hybrid revival language, I then say, okay, what can we learn from it? How can we apply lessons from the revival of Hebrew to the reclamation of Aboriginal languages? And then I start talking about Aboriginal language revival in Australia, and then I end up with language revival in general. The last two chapters are about the legal case for compensation for language revival and about mental health. I argue that there is a link between language reclamation and diminishing of or reduced suicidal ideation, just as there is a link between language loss and youth suicide. You know, there was an article in 2007 by Lalonde, Chandler, etc., and they found out that in British Columbia, Canada, the more your language was killed, the more likely you are to commit suicide. They took 6 tribes in British Columbia where you have Aboriginal people. I argue that just as language loss results in youth suicide, language reclamation results in empowered mental health. So this is the 9th chapter of the book. So the book is a journey from Israel to Australia and then all over the world.
Fascinating insights here. I think one of the aspects that I most appreciate of the book is what I perceive to be an anti-prescriptivist stance. And I wanted to talk about this. I think it's great that you claim that the revitalization of a language and the reclamation will lead to a new hybrid, that we need to be realistic that rather than purist and say, well, you know, if you want to preserve the language, it's going to have to evolve. There's no such thing as freezing it in time, right? And so that debunks a lot of myths that people have about languages. For instance, I specialize in Ladino or Judeo-Spanish. So people, even in the BBC, right, say, oh, in Bosnia, people speak medieval Spanish. And it's like, no, not really. They speak a language that might be based on Castilian, but has certainly evolved. And now it's a new hybrid, right? That we need to celebrate.
Absolutely. It's a little bit, Carlos, when I go to Canada, to Quebec, they say, oh, we speak the French of many, many centuries ago. The French people in France, they already changed it. What do you mean? You do not speak like centuries ago. Of course, shift happens. Shift happening is why you have linguistics. I mean, without shift happening, shift with an F, of course, I would have never been a linguist, because linguists love shift happening.
Yeah, that's a great word game. I found it very, it's very easy to remember. So it's very memorable, but at the same time, it's very true. And so here's one thing. So endangered languages are threatened or menaced from 2 angles. One is linguicide, which is language killing, as you said, and the other one is glottophagy, right? So Louis-Jean Calvet discusses this notion in his book on language and colonialism. And I wanted to ask about the role of language academies in glottophagia. So glottophagia, if I understood it correctly, is different from linguicide, in that linguicide is the forced disappearance of a language, whereas glottophagia is the encouragement of the assimilation of that language into a major language. So for instance, we're finding in the case of Ladino or Judeo-Spanish, and I know you're from Tel Aviv, so you're very well suited to discuss this, that there's the recent creation of a Judeo-Spanish Royal Academy of Language. And some in the academy, though not all, believe that Ladino will be better preserved if reconnected, quote unquote, to Spanish. What do you think about the sheer existence of academies that try to preserve languages and their most of the times humanitarian pretensions?
So I argue very strongly that the revival of a language needs an academy until the language is alive and kicking. So if we take Israeli as an example, Safa Brura, which is clear language, which was an organization that Eliezer Ben Yehuda, who is considered the father of Israeli, the Hebrew revivalist, he was part of it. And then Vaad HaLashon, which is the Committee of Hebrew, they were needed because it was during the revival of Hebrew. However, the Academy of the Hebrew Language that came to existence at the beginning of the 50s, I think in 1953, and it was kind of a superseding, it superseded the Vaad HaLashon, the Committee of Language. This is a redundant academy. And the reason is very simple, that by the time the Academy of the Hebrew Language, Academia ללשון העברית it is called, by the time it was established, Israeli was fully fledged. It was a full-fledged language, alive and kicking, spoken by 100% of the Sabras, the Jews who were born in Israel. Of course, you have migrants, but then they just learn from the local people how to speak. And therefore, we do not need a prescriptive, a normativist, puristic, august academy, because in fact, what it does is either a waste of time, telling people don't say that, because people will not listen to it, or it's a waste of money because it costs a lot of money. So it's a little bit like anybody who tells you, give us authenticity or give us death. I mean, the result will be death. I mean, this is what happened in Tiwi, on Tiwi Island near Darwin, which is in the northern part of Australia. They told the young Aboriginal people, give us authenticity or give us death. Of course, the young Aboriginal people decided to speak English. We don't speak or Aboriginal English, or Creole. We don't speak Tiwi anymore. So I argue that it is good to have an academy, but Académie Française, absolutely not. Académie ללשון העברית, absolutely not. Ladino or Judesmo or Judeo-Spanish, absolutely yes, because it is unfortunately a severely endangered language that requires a revival. So you need an academy for the efforts to revive the language. So Israeli at this stage of time is not endangered at all. I'm not talking about, God forbid, nuclear war or something like that, but you know, if there is no war or something like that, or a pandemic or whatever that will kill everybody, I'm not talking about that. When it comes to linguistics, there is no endangerment for Israeli. Israeli is alive and kicking. It is spoken by more than 9 million people. Of course, not as a native tongue by more than 6 million people.
So if I understood correctly, your point is academies when needed and required for the revitalization of the language, and no academy once that phase is completed. And my question then is, what delimits, what marks the transition between one stage and the other? Is it, as you said at the beginning, the percentage of kids that speak that language?
Yes, 100% of kids. And of course, absolutely. I mean, of course, when you have migrants to Israel, of course, you don't have 100% of Israel, but 100% of kids born to that tribe, which is the Jewish tribe, as opposed to Arabs who are not necessarily native speakers. Some of them might be, but so within the group, we call them tribes in Aboriginal Australia, but you know, we are all kind of tribal in the world. Unfortunately, one day maybe not, but COVID actually makes us even more localized and, you know, with more borders, etc. But when you have 100% of the kids within the group who speak the language, then you have no problem whatsoever. Of course, if it's 1% of 5 people, I would, maybe there is an absolute number as well. When you get to 1 million people, of course, 100% of kids, then you have no problem whatsoever.
Right. So it's intergenerational transmission with the critical mass.
Exactly. Yeah. With the critical mass. Exactly.
And so here's a paradox that I think I spotted in your book that got me thinking. I still haven't found out the answer to this. So the difference between language and dialect, for instance, right? Or the identification between a language, an identity, and a culture, the ideas of native language and mother tongue, these are all intractably linked to colonialism and the birth of the modern nation state. But at the same time, some authors, including you in Revivalistics, right, are drawing up on some of these notions like native in native title and other ideas, mother tongue, etc., to fight against revitalized languages by fighting colonialism, right? Because both are intractably linked. If you are pushing for Welsh, you're gonna have to reduce spaces where English only is spoken, and so I don't know if you're familiar with this quote that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. And so my question is, how do you square that circle? How do you empower endangered languages and fight colonialism without rejecting those categories like mother tongue, native language, etc.?
Well, firstly, let me see if I got your question correctly. For me, the definition of a native speaker has little to do with colonialism. So native speaker is a neurological definition. So I do accept the hypothesis by Descartes, by Chomsky, by, that your native speech, your native language is stored in a different part of your brain compared with your foreign languages. So for example, I, by and large, accept the notion that when, God forbid, you get a stroke, you might lose 12 languages that you know perfectly, but as foreign languages, and you are only left with your mother tongue. And this is why, for example, I knew a German woman in Australia, and when she got a stroke, she started speaking German, and no one at the hospital knew German. But she lived in Australia for like 70 years or so, but she couldn't speak English, even though, you know, but so it's kind of funny because I knew this woman, and when I tried to talk to her in German, I noticed that she had language attrition. So her German was kind of weird. But then when she got the stroke, of course, she spoke German. So, I mean, native speech for me, a native speaker is somebody who does not make mistakes in his or in her language, and somebody who does not sound foreigner in like accent-wise, etc. So I speak many languages, but obviously English is a non-native language for me. I can say whatever I want in English. I can say, I have no problem whatsoever. I can express myself perfectly well in English, but I'm not a native speaker. So native speaker is something that, for example, Aboriginal people who would like to be native speakers in their linguist-sided tongue, they will never be native speakers. Maybe their grandchildren will be native speakers. So this is one thing which has nothing to do with colonialism. When it comes to colonialism, I'll give you a funny example, but before that, I will give you something about nationhood. I discovered that in Israel, the fact that Eliezer Ben Yehuda was a politician, he was a political activist, and that's why he was the revivalist of Hebrew. The fact that he saw Hebrew as a unifying tongue for all the Jews coming from all over the world. Some of them spoke Judaismo or Ladino, some of them spoke Yiddish. In fact, most of them spoke Yiddish at the time of and the fin de siècle. Some of them spoke Arabic. He wanted a unifying tongue. The fact that he thought about the future state, the nationhood, the nation state, was in fact very, very good for the Hebrew revival because it was politically motivated, it was ideological. People wanted to speak the language of Isaiah for political reasons. And nowadays you have a country in which if you go to the court, you need to speak in Hebrew, in Israeli, right? If you want to be a member of the parliament, of the Knesset, you need to speak in Hebrew, well, in Israeli, etc., etc. This is a huge advantage. And of course, in Australia, when I reclaim Aboriginal languages, I do not know too many Aboriginal people. I do know, but I do not know too many Aboriginal people who would like to have their own state, which is kind of anti-colonial. So to have like a government which is in Bangla, a court which is in Bangla, everything in Bangla, and English, you know, like is out of the question. I do not know too many sovereignty people like that. I mean, there are, but it's very rare. So in a way, the best case scenario, hypothetically, would have been to have a tribe that wants to have its own state, like in Israel. And this would have met, and this anti-colonialism, which is like the most severe case of anti-colonialism, in the sense that you want to cancel the colonials, that would have been a great advantage linguistically. Of course, I'm not saying that I support such a divide, you know, like to many, many tribal states, etc. Now, last thing I wanted to say, and I think it is related to your question, but please feel free to continue the question if I did not answer. I went to the Bangla people and told them that the word for the seat of emotions in Bangla is the belly, Warna. It's a belly. But because all the words about happy and about all the words about happy and about you know, sad, etc., are in are with the stomach or the belly. But they told me, no, as Aboriginal people, we feel that the seat of emotions is the heart. Now, look, it's a fascinating and multifaceted case for you. You have a linguist who is not, or a revivalist who is not Aboriginal, but who knows the language much better than the custodians, because obviously I had to learn the language before I went to visit, and unfortunately the language was subject to linguicide prior to that. Then you have the Aboriginal colonized people who feel, allegedly because they're Aboriginal, that the seat of emotions is English because of the colonizing language, namely English. But inadvertently, so they feel, look, it makes much more sense. And they say, how do you know? You're not Aboriginal. Now, what do I tell them? Do I tell them, I mean, look, what you're saying is palpable poppycock. I mean, you're getting this from the English. It's a colon. You can inspire, you can influence, but you can never decide. The Aboriginal community or the minority community or the endangered language community or the revival language community is always at the wheel. They are in charge. You are the stepfather, they're the mother. The stepfather cannot tell the mother, shut up, you know, like, I know how to do, because the mother is a mother and you're just a stepfather. So this is a fascinating example of how sometimes the colonialism is embedded within the subjective feeling of what is to be Aboriginal, what is not to be Aboriginal. And you as an observer, you can observe, but you cannot actually make a difference sometimes.
Yeah, definitely. I think that the importance of community-led revitalization is key. Is key. At the end of the day, ultimately, the decision power has to lay in their hands, right? I want to go back to the idea of native speaker and mother tongue, because I completely agree with the fact that the way our brain experiences our first language is different qualitatively from the way it experiences other languages. But I think that this very notion is also covered by the concept of L1, right, or first language. So to me, the difference between first language and native language, or second, third, fourth language and foreign language, is precisely that. Is that it creates a nationalistic divide between the first language and other languages. And sometimes the language that you learn the first, you interrupt that learning, and it's not consecutive. But what I think that the difference between L1 and native is that native makes it look as though speaking the first language is a birthright and is a biologicist notion. Whereas if you understand languages as cultural artifacts, you're more prone to embrace the idea of first language rather than native. I do agree that if you want to empower a community, you need to embrace some kind of identitarianism, some kind of claim of identity. You cannot say, okay, languages are not self-contained, autonomous, discrete entities, but I support this language. There's a tension there, right?
But yes, but also I will give you a scenario in which you have 4 native languages or 4 mother tongues. And this is a scenario that I would have wanted the world to have. I want every person in the world to be a native speaker of 4 languages. And I will explain which 4 languages I'm talking about. The first language is the international language. Currently, it's American. It might well be the case if Chinese does the right changes, for example, getting rid of tones, getting rid of the Chinese characters in favor of pinyin, etc. It might be Chinese tomorrow, but international language, whatever it used to be French in Europe, etc. The second language that every person should have as a native tongue is the national language. So, for example, if you live in Spain, it would be Castellano, Spanish, or if you are in Italy, it'd be Italiano. The third language is your heritage language. So, for example, if you're Albanian living in Italy, or if you are a Jew from Germany or from Poland living in Italy, it should be Albanian or Yiddish. It's your heritage language, and you should be native speaker in your heritage language. And the fourth language in which you might want to be native as well is the language that has to do with your ikigai. Ikigai in Japanese is your raison d'etre. It's like what you're good at. It's the intersection between what you're good at, what you love, what the world needs, and what you're paid for. So that intersection is the ikigai. So if your ikigai is being a soprano, then you should probably know Italian, even if you live in Adelaide, in Australia. If your ikigai is to be a chef in a French restaurant, even if you're American and you have nothing to do with French heritage, you should know French. And so, in other words, I want everybody to have 4 different native tongues. All these languages are mother tongues or native tongues. However, only one of them is the heritage language. And when it comes to language revival, the most important thing is what's your heritage tongue that you're reviving. So if you're a heritage, this is what we call ownership. So in Australia, there is a distinction between ownership and usership. An Aboriginal person can own a language without even knowing one word in it, but they still own the language, which is very much against the native speech. You know, native speech is when you speak the language natively. Of course, you can own the language without being a native speaker. So for me, the use of native speech is a linguistic use, whereas the use of a heritage language is a more political, ecological, etc. But I make a distinction between the native speech and the heritage language. And by the way, L1 is a very misleading term, because if you're born in Japan and then your L1 is Japanese, but then you move to America when you're 2 and you speak no Japanese whatsoever, who cares about your L1? I mean,
it's what I said, and it's not necessarily consecutive either. You might be stronger in your L3 than in your L1, for instance, right?
Exactly.
So it's not unproblematic, but and I definitely like the idea of the ikigai, because I think it's part of our self-fulfillment as human beings.
Exactly. And I think that what you're saying is very important, Carlos, because when Abraham Maslow, the Jewish American psychologist, when he talks about the pyramid of self-actualization, which is at the top, it said, how many people reach it? Very, very few. Very, almost no people reach the top of the pyramid. I'm not talking about COVID, which makes us even lower on the pyramid. Some people do not even have safety. But I'm talking about, like, without COVID, I mean, most Chinese people would be kind of in the middle, love, partner, etc. But how many kind of go up? The technological revolution, which we are currently experiencing, this revolution that allows me to be in Adelaide, Australia, and to talk to you while you're in New York City, America, this revolution will eventually make people, turn people from seeking things to seeking ideas. And just as the Industrial Revolution turned people from seeking food to seeking things and change the world, this technological revolution will change the world. And this is when language revival will become much more common, and we will go up in that pyramid of Maslow, and we will get more and more to self-actualization. And I'm talking about the hoi polloi, I'm talking about the normies, the masses. I'm not talking about the elite, which is already there in the self-actualization.
Okay. I completely agree with your points on that. And I just have a final question. So when you talked about these 4 ideal native languages for everybody, I agree that it will be advantageous to speak all of that. But in the case of the national language and the heritage language, what happens, for instance, if somebody does not feel identified, talking about that Maslow pyramid again, does not feel that these languages are part of his, her identity? Can someone refuse to speak their heritage language? Or, for instance, I'm thinking about an independentist from Catalonia who is born in Spain but feels that as though his national inscription is more Catalan than Castilian.
Yes. Yeah, look, that's a very good question. And of course, the 4 languages are kind of an ideal world in which, and it has to do with instrumentality. So in other words, the fact that I want people to speak the international language, it's just because it's instrumental. When you go to give a lecture in Kyrgyzstan, you don't need to learn Kyrgyz within a month, because we don't have something to inject Kyrgyz to your chip, which we might have eventually, but we don't have it yet. And therefore, it will be easier to do it in American because everybody speaks the international language. Now, if you live in Barcelona, you live on La Rambla, then of course, and you're Catalan, and let's say you disagree with the Spanish regime, hegemony, etc., then of course we have a situation which you say, wait a second, then I do not agree with my national language. My national language is not Spanish. It's rather it should be Castellano. Now, here, of course, you have to make your own judgment. So, for example, I love Spain, and I love Catalonia, and I love the Basque country. But you need to decide. I mean, okay, if I live in Barcelona and I only speak Catalan, and I don't know how to write in Spanish, etc., will it kind of interfere with my success in life, etc.? So it's an instrumental. It's more like an instrumental.
Utilitarian.
Utilitarian, exactly, not deontological. But that's a very good point. It's utilitarian rather than deontological. However, I'm the first person in the world, especially that I do language revival for deontological reasons, for ethical, moral, deontological reasons rather than utilitarian reasons, although there are many utilitarian reasons. Given that I'm doing it for ethical, deontological reasons, I'm the first person to say, look, if your decision can be based on deontological reasons that might be counterproductive when it comes to utilitarianism. So I think that there is a lot of space for deontological, moral reasons in the world, because language revival itself is based on 3 types of reasons. One is deontological, one is aesthetic. The world is more beautiful with many languages, and the third one is utilitarian. So when I speak, for example, to civil servants, I use the utilitarian reasons for language revival. But when I speak to, say, some like politicians, not civil servants, but politicians, I actually use a lot of the ethical reasons, because I've noticed that some politicians would find the ethical and even the aesthetic reasons more appealing, whereas civil servants, they are the ones who need to say, okay, I give you $1 million. How many millions of dollars are you going to save for me? This is utilitarian, like bean counting. I am not a bean counter, and I would very much like to have a decision which is a linguistic decision based on morality rather than on utilitarian. So deontological morality rather than on utilitarian morality.
Yeah, I think it's great both to make people know that deontological reasons are powerful, and in most cases may come even first, but at the same time be able to pitch it strategically and to be able to speak to people's priorities and needs. But yeah, I totally agree that we often encounter in society this false question of, well, why should we save this language, which presupposes that only utilitarian reasons are valid. But just a human right period. You can just end the discussion there, but then you wouldn't get the funding if the funding is based on utilitarian reasons. And just my last point, when you said that native speakers don't make mistakes in the language, I think most highly educated people whose first language is X wouldn't make a lot of mistakes in X. But I think that as a matter of fact, most people are not highly educated. So as a result, they do make a lot of mistakes, right? Like I know a lot of people here in Spain who make a lot of mistakes all the time in Spanish, for instance, right? Even though it's their first language, maybe it's the only language they speak, as a matter of fact. So I think education there also makes a difference, right?
Wait, are you now in Spain or in New York?
Right now in Spain, because the course hasn't started yet in New York, so I'm still here.
So you're in Spain. So you're in Zaragoza now. That's
right.
Wow, that's beautiful. Sorry, when I talked about the technological thing, I thought that you were in NYU, but it's still remarkable that you're in Spain and I'm in Australia. It's the other side of the globe.
Yeah.
But remind me again about the point that you were making just now.
Yeah, the education barrier. So
look, I argue, Carlos, that if you're a native Spanish speaker, you never make mistakes. So, for example, if you're a native American speaker, you never make mistakes. If you're a native Israeli speaker, you never make. I'll give you an example. According to, say, the Queen's English or whatever, you're not supposed to say yous for plural. So you is for both singular and plural. However, when I go to the bush, to the outback, when I talk to the Aboriginal people, they say, if I'm on my own, they say, what do you think? If I bring a delegation, say, what do you think? This is absolutely not a mistake. This is perfect in their own language. Now, here we arrive at the question of what is language, and a language is a generalization. A language is a collection of lects, of sociolect, idiolects, dialects, etolects, which is according to your age, and other lects, ethnolects. For me, no native speaker makes a mistake. You might argue that in your own, like Hoch Castellano or High Castillano, you speak in a different way from another type of Castellano, which is more dialectal, etc. But the point of the matter is that I disagree that, in Valladolid or in, what's the name, Salamanca, they say we speak the best Spanish and everybody else doesn't know how to speak Spanish. I totally disagree with that. Or, like in Florence or in Siena, they say we speak the best Italian. This is just a matter of taste. I've just broken my wrist, unfortunately, following an encounter with a snake in the Kimberley, in the northern part of Western Australia, and therefore I'm in Adelaide. I had to rush for a surgery, and now I have, I'm bionic, like Steve Austin. Like I have some metal stuff. But why am I saying it to you that I went to? So I took two friends of mine who are Aussies to see the place where Melech Ravitch, who was a Jew, arrived in 1933 in order to establish a Jewish state. It's funny, in the Northern Territory. And we were sitting there, it's called Mataranka, and there were some Aussies in the hot springs, and they were talking like very much like Aussies, like, no worries, mate, it's nine, like it's 9. So no worries, mate, it's 9. No worries, mate, it's 9 o'clock, And my friend said, oh, I'm so ashamed of being an Aussie. I said, why? Because listen to this type of people, how they speak, it's abomination. And I said, what do you mean? They're native speakers. This is their language. So what they meant was that their language is perceived of as uneducated. However, they never make mistakes. These Aussies, they never make mistakes. And in fact, everything is consistent. So if they say, no worries, mate, they will say, what's your name? They will not say, what's your name? Everything is consistent, and they're native speakers. So for me, really, I mean it when I say that native speakers do not make mistakes. You might say, okay, if somebody is drunk, suddenly they cannot actually produce a sentence or something like that. That's something different. Or a child.
So the point is that insofar as there's logical consistency, then it's not a mistake. Right.
And there is logical consistency. So, for example, in Israel, the Academy of the Hebrew Language rebukes Israelis for saying 10 shekel instead of 10 shekalim, which means $10 or 10 shekels. Shekel is the dollar, the Israeli dollar.
Yeah.
But actually, 10 shekel is perfectly grammatical. What the Academy of the Hebrew Language is trying to do, and this is, in a way, this kind of circles our discussion to your first question. The Academy of the Hebrew Language is trying to slaughter the Israeli language and to force a Hebrew grammar on a revival language that has its own distinct grammar that is based not only on Hebrew, but also on Yiddish. So you see, I disagree with this puristic attitude of saying to people, you should say this is not true, etc. On the what I would like a linguist and a revivalist to do is to say, okay, how does the native speaker say that? Oh, this is the way that they say, okay, this is the grammar of the language. And when it comes to language revival, where you do not have, or language reclamation, sorry, when you do not have native speakers at all, then of course we need to be embracing the hybridity of the emerging tongue. And maybe last thing that I would like to emphasize is that if you have friends, if you have listeners, if you have audience that are very good at languages, instead of just, or not instead, in addition or besides learning beautiful, like Esperanto and also so art languages like Klingon, etc. I want you to know that there are so many tribes out there who are waiting for you to go and to offer your services. Because if you are a good language learner, a good foreign language, a hyper polyglot, you should use your hyper polyglotism for the sake of improving this world, righting the world, the wrong of the past. Because especially in the new world, we have killed so many languages. And when we say we, I mean Anglos, Spaniards, Portuguese, Dutch, etc., etc. We've killed so many languages. We have the obligation, especially Europeans, we have the obligation to assist these people whose languages were subject to linguicide to reconnect with their intellectual sovereignty, to reconnect with their cultural autonomy, to reconnect with their well-being, and most importantly, to reconnect with their soul. They have lost their soul sometimes.
I think this is the best possible message to bring this conversation to a conclusion, because with great power comes great responsibility, and every hyper polyglot that is in a position of responsibility and power will agree with you that one of the best things we can do is to learn an endangered language. And that's why I specialize in Ladino, for instance, definitely. So Professor Ghil'ad Zuckermann, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much for this conversation.